Old York is a great place to see hands-on how people would have lived in our history.
It really is living history. It's a chance to see the past come alive.
Artifacts here really do tell me a story. It's great to just look back and know where we've come from.
It's hard to go into one of these homes, hear some of these stories, and not walk out and see your world and your life in a very different way.
Because it's from our history that we learn about the origins of our own daily life.
To me, what's important about Old York is it tells the story of the other New England, that this was a place that was different, a place that you don't find in the textbooks.
I want people to come here and feel like they can tell us what they're interested in, and we can help them find it.
We know that people have been living in York for about 12,000 years. First Native Americans moved into the region when the glaciers retreated, and they were farmers growing corn, bean, and squash along the banks of the York River, and they called the place Agamenticus. We know that they were still living here when the first European explorers arrived around 1600.
We tend to think of early New England as Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, settled by Puritans for religious purposes, people coming here to start the city on the hill, set the example for the world. These people weren't doing that, they were coming to try to make money.
Many of them came here from Massachusetts because they were thrown out of there because they weren't Puritans. So this is the other New England. This is not like what you're going to see down in Massachusetts. The Candlemas Raid, maybe one of the most important events in York's history. In 1692, where a band of Wabanaki warriors came into town and killed or took captive over 100 of the settlers and burnt most of the settlement to the ground.
These people were on the edge of the New England frontier, so when raiding parties came south, they tended to hit these communities.
And to some degree, maybe it's a tribute to the settlers of York that those who remained refused to leave, and they rebuilt the town out of its ashes and created really kind of the beginnings of the town that we know today.
Possibly the most symbolic building is the old jail, because it speaks to the time when York was this civic center. The jail for all of Maine was in the town of York.
The jail is one of the earliest public buildings in America. It was built in 1719.
The jailer actually occupied the same building. His own living quarters would be located next to the prison cells, to keep an eye on the prisoners.
You have really very kind of horrible, miserable living conditions for people who are really severe criminals, but then also to really nice cells for people who are in jail just because of debt. Yeah, the Jeffords Tavern was built in 1754 and stood in Wells until the mid-20th century when it was reassembled here in York.
It first stood at the end of what's now Radon Road down the street and served as an aid to Allies station in World War II. Then it was moved yet again to its current location.
It is really kind of a wonderful building because it is a public building, a tavern, and is very different than what a house would have been like in the 18th century.
And the second time it was put back together, it was done with the mixture of attention to historical detail and a certain amount of imagination that characterizes the colonial revival. So when you're inside the tavern, you're seeing something of what a colonial hostelry looked like, but you're also seeing something of what people in the first half of the 20th century imagined they looked like. And it's not entirely accurate, but it's fun.
The schoolhouse, which is next to the tavern, dates to the mid-18th century as well, and is a great place to see what education would have been like 200 or 300 years ago, where all the students are jammed into one classroom with one teacher.
If you were to go inside this schoolhouse, and if you get down right along the walls and you go right up next to it, you'll find some extant examples of graffiti. And some of the examples are actually quite beautiful.
The flowering of York economically occurs once it becomes safe to live here until around the time of the American Revolution.
The wharfs and warehouses of the river were busy with activity.
You had the York River nearby, so you had a lot of ships coming through, bringing in a lot of goods, stuff from Europe. Things were going great.
So there are fortunes built on trading.
One of the unique features at Old York is the John Hancock warehouse. It was only owned by Hancock for a few years, but yes, the famous signer of the Declaration of Independence did own this wharf in York as a part of his merchant activities.
It's the only largely intact 18th century warehouse on the southern Maine coast.
So you can really go back in time and see what the business world was like on the busy colonial waterfront when you walk inside the John Hancock's warehouse. Also, of course, we have the George Marshall store, which is next to the wharf and the warehouse, and that's a 19th century waterfront store.
In the 1890s, George Marshall, through an act of the Maine legislature, got permission to expand his wharf. Now the George Marshall store is an art gallery that features 4 or 5 shows a year by regional artists.
Things take a downturn in the 19th century as you've got things like the Embargo Act and the War of 1812 that really halt trade up in this region.
The port of York is effectively closed, and most of the merchants are driven into bankruptcy. Actually, some commit suicide, and is a very difficult time economically for York. And after that point, for much of the 19th century, York is a little bit of a kind of a sleepy country town, and it won't really rebound for a while.
The Ramsdale House is a special and unique place among historical museums in New England. It's the only farm laboring family's home that we know of. It represents the way most people lived in New England in the 18th and the first half of the 19th century.
It's really important that you have a working class house survive like that, because normally these are so kind of small and mean that they don't survive.
The walls are completely bare. What you see instead are the exposed beams. You really just see the skeleton of the house and how exactly it was put together.
We think it's much more interesting to share with everybody the puzzle that house is. The Emerson Wilcox house documents wonderfully the rise and to some extent decline of the merchant families.
Emerson Wilcox House is another house actually that was put together. There were two mid-18th century houses, one that was there and another that was added to it. So walking through it is kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, and it's kind of fun to see if you can figure out which house am I in now. I'm not quite sure.
Each room is actually set to a different period. So you start out in the mid-1700s, but then you move through time up to about the early 20th century. And what's really great about that is that it allows us to see the changes taking place in daily life during that 200-year span.